Welcome in, heroes and villains alike, to another episode of the Cloaks and Capes podcast. I'm Robbie Landis, along with me, my guest host, Kali Scales, and our guest today, coming from the Tabletop Talespinners network, Emma. Welcome to the Cloaks and Capes podcast.
Thank you for having me, Robbie and Kali. It's great to be here.
It is a pleasure to have you. Emma is actually a player in one of Kali's campaigns. I'm a player in one of Emma's campaigns, and maybe one day I'll also be able to DM for Emma. I am looking forward to that day. I don't know how looking forward to it you are based on stories that you've heard.
Well, seeing as I've been watching the Second Chances and hearing plenty from Kali over the past few months that I've known you guys, I'm both scared and excited.
I think excited is the better way to lean. Kali and I have a special relationship, so a lot of the things that I have put her through, narratively speaking, I've never put anybody else through. And maybe I will, maybe I won't. Who knows? We'll see what happens. But today's show is a little bit different than I think the last few that we've had. You know, the podcast here, we kind of look to, I guess, inform, and I'm going to say with heavy air quotes, educate people, you know, both new and veteran players alike on certain topics. But you and I had a really, I thought, interesting discussion a while ago that I've always wanted to kind of pick apart. And I think since we have three of us DMs here, this would be the perfect time to do so. Kali, I know that you're a big fan of Curse of Strahd. It was the first module that you ran for your paid games on Start Playing. Emma, you've also spoken very highly of Curse of Strahd, and I know a lot of people.
He's running it now.
I am running it now.
That's right. You're running it professionally as well, and a lot of people, I think, speak very highly of it. You know, whether it's their first module that they do or it's one of the more memorable ones, I always see people speaking very well of it. But I also see people, and this isn't like a case of like, oh, well, one side says this, the other side says this. I feel like it's the same people saying it's the best one that I've ever been in, it's the best one I've ever run, but also Curse of Strahd sucks. And yes, specifically where yeah.
No,
exactly. But really quick, before you go, because I do want to hear your take on it first, is when Emma had started reading through it to DM it, she was obviously, you know, you had said you were thinking back to when you had played it with your DM and how great it was. And you're like, wow, a lot of stuff that my DM did, or a lot of stuff that I remember, isn't in here. And I got to thinking, like, is the reason that Curse of Strahd is so good is because it sucks?
No, so here's the thing. Curse of Strahd, the book, is a really, really good framework for a game. It gives you a setting that's interesting and good cities and some interesting characters, but the actual progression of the story, they basically took what was in 2E back when Ravenloft came out, whether it was 1E or I think it was 2E, when that first came out, the whole of the campaign was just the dungeon crawl through Castle Ravenloft and fighting Strahd. Like, you started off in the city of Barovia and then went into the dungeon and fought Strahd. That was the whole campaign. They tried to extend that out into an entire, like, 12-level adventure, and there's a lot of places where their source material runs real thin, and it's not particularly good. But why everyone ends up loving it is because the setting is interesting. It has one of the most dedicated fan bases of any setting I've seen. The Reddit thread dedicated to Curse of Strahd is massive and has tons and tons of homebrew content that adds to the world and builds in line with the story so that there's more things to do that are interesting along the way. And that's why I think Curse of Strahd is always remembered as being good, because there's a lot of supplementary content for it. But yeah, if you just play like straight up just the book, Curse of Strahd is a little thin.
Emma, what are your thoughts on it?
Oh, yeah, because like you said, when we were having that conversation, like, my thought was, oh, I'm going to look in this book and there's going to be... So I've actually never DM'd a module before, so I didn't really know what to expect going into it. But
Strahd was my first.
Strahd was my first module that I've looked into. We
got to really clarify that. Saying Strahd is my first out of context does not sound good, actually. Unless it's Beth the Bard's, she is the ancient. She can be
Oh,
my curse. I'm fine with that.
absolutely. Yes.
Absolutely fine.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt. Continue.
Yes. Mommy, sorry.
Mommy? Oh,
No, you're not. You're not sorry.
No, I'm not,
so
but
true.
that's fine. But Curse of Strahd was the first module that I've ever opened up to GM. And so having played it, and I have to specify here, I played essentially half of it because my GM was great, but we were college friends. It wasn't a professional game by any means. And I chose to play a strange class by playing a gunslinger, and the way he chose to adapt it just didn't really mesh with my play style, so I ended up dropping out a little early. But I had some great moments in that campaign for the year that I did play it. And so when I went to GM it, I was like, oh, there has to be that story progression that I was experiencing when I played in the game in the module. And then I opened it up and I discovered that it was basically just, like Kali was explaining, it was a list of settings, and then when you get there, there are certain events that trigger when you go certain places. Mm-hmm. And there are certain NPCs that get you there. And I was like, wait, so all this cool stuff that my GM added isn't here. Yeah. Like, for example, when we played, our first meeting with Strahd happened in the cemetery when Irina and Ismark were burying their father.
Well, that's very early.
It was very early.
You guys meet her meet him right away.
Mm-hmm. And so we were like, oh no. And like he immediately tried to kidnap Irina, and we were all panicking because we were level 3 and this was the BBEG.
You're like, his name is in the book is named after him.
That's not good.
Are we supposed to like do we go after him?
Mm-hmm. And so we were sitting here fighting Strahd at level 3, trying to get him to let go of Irina so he would leave. And thankfully, it was one of those where we just had to do one thing that scared him off enough to be like, fine, I'll leave you all alone for now. But it was such an interesting start to the story because it gave us this framework of like, oh, this is how terrifying this person we're going against is, as we were trying to continue with the main plot line of getting Irina away from him to safety.
So this is my theory on why I think, based on what both of you have told me, what I've heard from other people, on why Curse of Strahd is such a good module because it's a bad module, right? Mm-hmm. And I know that people, I think, tend to fall into one of two camps when it comes to rules or like materials provided. You know, you have the people who love the idea that D&D is like a sandbox system and a sandbox setting you can play within, and it's modular and you can add all that you want of your own stuff. And then you have people who like the rules, who want you to tell them how to interpret things, who just want more and more and more and more stuff there for them that they don't have to, like, I guess, pre-build necessarily. It's not to say that they don't prep, but maybe they just like to prep different sort of things. And I think that because there's not a lot there for Strahd, it requires that you have to do that thing. And as a result of having so little, every DM comes up with their own thing, and you end up getting an adventure that from table to table is always going to be so widely different. I mean, Kali, in your Curse of Strahd games, you went along a sort of a similar route that Beth the Bard did in making Irina. Well,
not
you made
really,
Irina
Irina was the villain.
Sorry. Beth the Bard gender bent Strahd into being
Correct.
A woman, whereas you kind of did a role swap, making Irina the central villain, but it wasn't obviously, I think, revealed until much later.
Yeah, my campaign in Curse of Strahd, the big reveal at the end of Act 1 was that this game took place 800 years after a completed version or a completed game of the original Curse of Strahd book. and Irina has become the new countess of the land, and that's her big betrayal is at the end of Act 1.
Yeah, and your players loved that. They went crazy for it, right?
Well, loved is a term for it. They were horrified and angry and then ready to kill her.
After the fact, looking back on it now, they're never going to sit down at another Curse of Strahd table and probably be blown away on the same level of that, right?
Well, one of my players is in Emma's Curse of Strahd game, and messaged me, was like, we just met Irina, and I gotta tell you, part of me doesn't trust her. I don't want to help her.
They've just finished their first session, so I am starting them in a different spot because you never did Death House.
No, we didn't.
I am taking them through Death House to start them off, so I'm trauma bonding them before they get to Irina.
There you go. Yeah, because I know for that one player, it's gonna be hard when you start getting towards the end of Act 1. Although the end of Act 1 ends in a very different place than I did, but it'll be one of those things that you really remember. And for me, it was super cool because the game that it takes place 800 years after was the one that I played through with my friends. So all of our characters from that party were NPCs now who had become vampires.
That's pretty cool.
It was super fun.
So, all right, obviously the players who are playing through these for you, right? In 5 years' time, now if you sit them down and you get them talking, you're like, what's the best module you've ever played through? A lot of them, I imagine, would probably say your Curse of Strahd game. Yeah. So now, as DMs, knowing that a game that doesn't give you all of the stuff that you wish that it would give you turns out to be such an amazing experience for your players, as a DM, do you think that it's smart? Actually, let me rephrase this because I don't want it to be a binary. Should you do this or should you do that? To what level do you think that a module or an adventure should give you details and should give you these story elements so that you still have room to be able to work in your own things? Should it be, very, very few? So like in Curse of Strahd, you got to do a lot of the work yourself, and it ends up being a very a varied story from table to table to table? Or should there be a baseline that then encourages you to maybe take it in some different directions?
I think it depends on if if the baseline is good, then so take Out of the Abyss, right? Out of the Abyss is a pretty universally lauded module for 5e. And it's super fun. It's an interesting trip into the Underdark, and it deals with some of the major names of D&D, and the Drow feature heavily, and there's a lot of really cool stuff there. And so that's one where I think a lot of people are fine kind of following it by the book pretty close. Then take Descent into Avernus, which is a really cool concept in theory, and I think that adventure sucks. I was running my party through it, and I was like midway into Act 2 when I was like flipping through and reading the end of it, and I'm just like, that's how this ends? Oh, that sucks. And I just completely changed the whole story from there on in because I thought it was terrible.
Which is why I think it really depends on what type of DM you are. Because I think we all, like Kali and I, thrived on it because we're homebrew DMs. We very much will warp a story, and we have no hesitation about changing it or making it different for the players and the story that they want to tell in the world. And Curse of Strahd provides a great framework because there's already little enough there that we can be like, great, we can work within the bounds of what's been given to us without having to change a whole lot. Whereas if you get a module that has a through-line story and you hate it, like you were just saying, Kali, then there's a lot of work that goes into, okay, well, how do I scrap this whole piece and keep the stuff I like, but still change it to where I'm happy?
For Descent into Avernus is easy. You just get rid of the Hollyphant. That's all you got to change, and the story is instantly better because they're so annoying.
Look, based on what I've talked with Kali and I've seen and heard from her players, honestly, she seems to thrive more when it is a bad story, because you just said that like Descent into Avernus is terrible, and that's another one that because you changed it so heavily, that didn't that lead into like a multiversal campaign where like you took multiple members from each table and did like an Infinity War type thing. So you know what, Wizards, give Kali more terrible modules and adventures in source books.
More hot garbage.
Whatever you're gonna release next, just cut half of it out and send it her way, and she's gonna have the best. She might not have the best time with it. Her players are gonna have the best time with it.
I think the true value of those books is the framework, though, and is being able to take them and make them your own. I'm doing a Call of the Netherdeep campaign right now, which, Robbie, I just played through your Call of the Netherdeep game, and I've got a couple players who were also in that game who wanted to play in mine, because they knew I'd probably change it, not wanting to do the exact same story again.
Absolutely.
So in Call of the Netherdeep, there's a spot in the second act where you have to align yourself with one of three factions. And there's the Cobalt Soul, which are like the goodly, intelligent monks. There's the Allegiance of Allsight, which is mage school, effectively. And then there's the Consortium of the Vermilion Dream, which are borderline Nazis, and they're probably super evil. So my players were, of course, all ready to be like, fuck the Consortium of the Vermilion Dream when we get there. So I made it that one of their characters' evil moms, effectively, was the new leader of the Cobalt Soul, or the Allegiance of Allsight. Another player's ex-wife, who was super evil, was the leader of the Cobalt Soul. And then the Consortium had recently been overthrown and had new leadership, which was actually very useful to them. So now they're having to work with the Consortium, which they did not expect at all. But I think that's interesting.
Yeah. Speaking of Call of the Netherdeep, I think there's some good examples in there of how to do what we're talking about in a good way, to where it gives you some direction but leaves enough runway for you to make your own stuff, but maybe not necessarily be required to. And then they do some stuff. Yeah, they also do some stuff where they leave it way too open.
Yeah.
And I wish there was a little bit more direction. And that comes in the form of the rivals, right? Early on in the beginning of Call of the Netherdeep, because I don't want to spoil too much. It's not too new or too
There's
old
a rival
of a
party.
module necessarily. But yes, you meet a rival party that could get the MacGuffin before you get the MacGuffin. Basically, the idea is that the MacGuffin maybe bounces back and forth between your parties, right? Now, obviously, if you have a table that's focused on like the narrative or has the idea of like, hey, this rival party is supposed to be here throughout the adventure, hopefully your party isn't just like, well, let's just kill them in the first fight. We never have to deal with them again, right? Cool.
Man,
if they are...
that'd be a very different story.
Yeah. If they are like enemies or kind of like neutral to you, to where maybe different members of their party feels a few different ways about yours and vice versa, you're not going to try to kill each other every time you meet, but there's a very obvious dynamic there of you have something that we want and we want to take it from you, vice versa. That's cool. There's a lot of different ways you can go with that. There's a lot of different ways to interpret that, right? They're trying to stop you at certain turns. You know, you have to convince them to maybe help you or wait. Just a lot of stuff you can do with that. And then the issue that we ran into when I was doing it is they were real friendly on both sides. And so now what that turns into is whenever you meet them and they would normally be trying to hinder you, now what's stopping them from just helping you? And instead of a combat or a dungeon where there should only be 5 or 6 party members, you have double that. So I had to try and come up with interesting ways to have them there, but have them not break the balance of the game. And the book didn't really give any insight on how to handle the friendly rivals being there, except that maybe they help the party. Well, Matt, I don't want them to help the party because 12 people in this fight is too much.
So I've been dealing with exactly that because my group is very friendly with the rival party.
Oh, I bet they are.
They are very indeed. There was some smooching.
I heard that you killed off someone's NPC boyfriend just so that they would have to go smooch Gelsariad or something.
No, they were smooching Gelsariad, and that's who I killed.
Oh, well, that was mean of you.
I would agree with that. But one thing that I've taken to is kind of just explaining to my players, like in those kinds of fights, they are there and they are helping and they are fighting other enemies, but we're not going to have them as part of our turn order because that's going to make a massive fight that's going to take forever to do.
So kind of just a suspension of disbelief that even though they're here and we're maybe we're
they're
like
fighting
a
other goons. They're fighting other goons.
Let's say that the area is the size like a football field. They're here and you see them over there fighting stuff, but I'm not going to put an extra half of new enemies on and go through what they're doing.
Right. I'm not going to double the fight length just for the sake of it, like of them being there and part of it.
Okay, so and I think that's a fine way to deal with that. And again, suspension of disbelief is something we all use to varying degrees. But you do kind of wish that there was a more satisfying way to be able to do that.
I mean, and I will say full disclosure, twice now, they have done major encounters where there has been 12 people on the turn order because they've been fighting with them. They fought a purple worm together and they fought a Nudok together.
I got swallowed by said purple worm.
You did get swallowed by a purple worm.
Yeah,
it's Robbie's goal to swallow somebody in one of his games.
They always get away, and it's because everybody has face step. Jeremy, if you ever watch this, nerf face step. One of the issues in regards to that I came into as well is like, obviously there are some ways to deal with it, right? You could have some of them like be in trouble and have to rescue them. But if you do that every single time, then they just come across as incompetent more than anything else. So I do think that overall it does a lot of really, really cool things correctly, but could definitely use a few improvements. And, I haven't done a whole lot of modules. I think that Call of the Netherdeep was the first one that I ever DM'd. Yeah. I had played through a few, but I don't go and like read through the module as I'm, playing through it or whatever. But right now, Keys to the Golden Vault, that's one that it's just adventures. It's just like, here's a mission, period. That's it. And I'm adapting that into a homebrew Exandrian campaign. And I think a lot like what you guys had described when going through something like Curse of Strahd, there's a lot you have to fill in, especially if you're in a homebrew setting or, playing in another established setting. You have to go through and like change a bunch of names, change locations, add in all sorts of stuff. But I think that when we eventually end up coming out of the other end of it, I think it'll end up being better for it as a result.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think one of the... Like, there's, as a DM, it can be intimidating sometimes to, like, change a module a ton to suit your style or to suit what you have. There's that, like, lingering feeling of, like, hey, this was a, professionally published book from creators of the game. Like, maybe I should honor that. And then you eventually just get to a point where you're like, yeah, just because it's professionally published doesn't mean it doesn't suck. So, you know what? Do your thing. Your players are not at the table to play Curse of Strahd. They're at the table to play your interpretation of Curse of Strahd. One of my players in one of my games had played through Curse of Strahd 4 times before they got to my table. And that was intimidating, where I'm like, oh, they're going to know every detail. But then as I started changing the game up, it was just super rewarding for them because they're like, oh, this is a take on it I've never seen before. This is cool.
I have one of my players at my table. He GM'd Curse of Strahd before he came to my table, and he was very much like, I don't want to metagame or like let everybody else know that I know this module front and back because I've GM'd it.
Yep.
And his character is so interesting because he created this character that basically was like an isolated like scholar who doesn't really know much about the outside world, period. And it was so funny because we got into Death House, and as the party was making their way through, he was like, why are we wasting time checking every single room in this house? Like, we know where the threat is supposed to be. Let's just go to the threat. And then they finally ducked into a room that had a library in it, and his opinion changed immediately. Yeah. And I love that it allows like those little things where it's like...
So, first of all... Shout out to Death House, which ends more games than any introductory dungeon I've ever seen in my life. In Death House, there is an animated broom hidden in that house, and that thing is a menace to level 1 players. It gets 2 attacks.
I have a question specifically for you, Emma, as a DM who is new to doing a module, and I want to see if it lines up with what I felt doing Waterdeep Dragon Heist. That was my first module, not Call of the Netherdeep, that I DM'd, and what I ran into, and maybe it's not as bad with Curse of Strahd because it's a self-contained like demiplane sort of place, and I think the way you guys have described it is it's very much set up with a kind of world map in that you start one place and have to go to like these different locations, and then Waterdeep is just this massive, it's fantasy New York, and what I felt running that, we finished it all the way through it, and my players loved it. I hated it, not because of there's nothing wrong with the campaign, the module, the setting itself, and maybe with something like Curse of Strahd, the way you describe it, I'd be better suited there. But I can't sit down and just be like, all right, well, today I'm going to read through Waterdeep so that I know everything there is to know about Dragon Heist, right? I'm like, we're gonna go chapter by chapter. When I know a chapter, I'll read the next one. And what that ended up doing for me as a DM who came strictly from homebrewing stuff and improving everything and making everything up on the spot is when people asked a question that I didn't know the answer to, I was hesitant and I lacked the confidence to make a choice because I was like, well, what if I do something that later on this creates a plot hole or it puts me in a position that's going to make it difficult? And obviously people will say, oh, well, you DM just make something up. And like, obviously that's the answer, but you want to not be put into that position if you can help it. Do you feel any of that in Curse of Strahd?
Yes.
So, yes. It's actually really funny you say that because before I ran it as a paid game, I had run it for some friends, including my best friend of 13 years who has never played D&D before she sat down at my table. And I hated the first time I ran it for everyone because everyone was having so much fun because I was focusing on their story, but I did exactly what you said, Robbie. And I instead of being hesitant about it, I dove head first and I was like, if I come up with something that's not in the book, I will figure out later how to twist it.
And you're like, yeah, Strahd can be your boyfriend. A chapter later, oh no.
No, so I didn't do that. But there was a moment where they left to do the Wizard of Wines.
Oh, they left Vallaki for the Wizard of Wines. Yeah.
And they left Irina and Ismark in Vallaki while they did it. And it wasn't necessarily that I made a bad decision. It was I misread something and I misremembered it. So I thought it said that if like Irina and Ismark were left alone in Vallaki, that that Isaac, the guard captain,
Isaac,
would kidnap Irina. And I don't know why. I don't know why I thought that, but for some reason I thought that it was in the book, and then I went back to the section later to plan it after I left them on a cliffhanger with it, and was like, wait,
that's not.
Did I just imagine this? It's not here. And then there's complicated lore stuff with Isaac and Irina that I was like, oh, I didn't know this when I made this decision, and now this makes this a weird choice.
Yeah.
Strahd's big struggle is that it is meant to be kind of an open world adventure where you go where you want to go. But because of that, depending on the order you go to places in, different things will happen. So it is hard to do Curse of Strahd chapter by chapter. It is a book that you're supposed to read through all the way so that you know the different ways things can play out. But screw that. I didn't do that.
Yeah, well, here's the thing. Even small things can sometimes throw, wrenches into the works, or even end up being like a cool thing. Something that happened in my Waterdeep campaign is you visit like a secondhand knick-knack store at some point, or you have the option to go in there and they have like a purple beholder sign or whatever. And when you go in there, it mentions that there's like a beholder plushie that serves, I guess, like a mascot of the store or something that's just kind of up there. And when I had mentioned that, my partner who was playing with us at the time, she's like, I want that. Can I try and talk him into selling that to me? Sure. What harm is that? I know she likes plushies. Like that's going to be a cool moment for her. And then it's not till late. I don't know. I missed it when this happened. So I don't know if I just didn't read that over or if they mentioned this next part at some other time, but that beholder plushie is like a divination sensor for Xanathar. For some reason, he wants to keep an eye on that shop in particular, so she's been carrying around this plushie that, one of the BBGs of Waterdeep can see through. And it wasn't until like sessions later that I found that out, and I'm like, oh. Like, had I known that, the shopkeep probably wouldn't have sold that to her, because maybe it's there for a reason,
Right.
but now they've said some nasty things about Xanathar, so I got to send assassins after them. So it was fine. But when doing official content, that's always my fear. And I think I definitely prefer things to be a lot more open, leave it up to interpretation. Don't just give DMs a chance to leave their mark. Put them in a position where they have to leave their mark, where they have to make a world their own. What are your thoughts on that? We'll use this as our sort of closing here. To what level do you think DMs should be required to make a world their own?
I think DMs should always have the option to do so, and the books should be designed with that in mind, that like, hey, we are intending that you're going to kind of fill in some of the gaps here. But I also say that as someone who is so entrenched in doing so, and I've just realized I can't tell someone else's story. I have to make it my own now. I know there are DMs, especially young DMs, like fledgling DMs out there, for whom a book that just kind of lays it all out is very valuable to them. So I think that's a good thing to have. But I strongly believe that the best stories are told when you go off script. So I think there is a value in books lending themselves towards that.
I think there's a place for both, because I definitely have like some friends who I've spoken to that, like, I have a friend, for example, exclusively runs modules, because she has said to me multiple times that she cannot homebrew. She can't start from nothing. She can definitely twist a story once she has character backstories. And so she'll add little things based on what she thinks will work best for the characters that she has at her table. But once she has to have that framework in order to do it. And so I think there are certain people who are more comfortable with the more detail I have already, then I can start slowly branching out. And I think thinking of it that way is a great way to see it, because there are GMs like myself and Kali that'll say, oh, if I don't like this part of a story, it's gone. There have been whole parts of Curse of Strahd I am having to cut because my tables have hard lines against harm to children. And that's a huge thing that they included in many sections of Curse of Strahd, where I'm just like, okay, we're just gonna scrap that piece there. And
yeah, we had a long talk about lines and veils in my session 0, and I let them know straight up, like, these are some of the things that are in this story. Are we comfortable with dealing with them? Because this story is dark.
Absolutely. And I made it very clear up front for everyone that I was happy to throw away anything that went against something that, like, I wasn't going to put them through something that they weren't comfortable with just because it was included on this module. Like, there is always ways to change the story. There's always a way to make something better and not include something that is going to hurt somebody. But we did have some clarifications on, like, where is the line with harm to children? What stuff can I still include that would still lend to the story without causing any harm?
Oh, Kresik, what a nightmare you are.
So I think
I know
closing,
exactly which part of the story you're talking about.
Yep.
I think the closing thoughts that I'd like to list our viewers, our listeners with today is that if you come across a module, if you come across an adventure that feels like it is missing chunks, that might not necessarily mean that it's poorly written. That could be intentional on the part of the designers because they want you to fill that in. It could still just also mean that it's bad too. Or that's 100% possible. I don't want to say that just because the story doesn't make sense. I think if it doesn't make sense, that's probably bad writing. But if it requires you to put your own spin on it, I think that's something that you should embrace. And I think that if you find that you can, that doing that is going to lead to a much more memorable experience for your players. Emma, thank you so much for joining us today. Again, from Tabletop Talespinners. Here at the end of the show, we like giving our guests a chance to talk a little bit about themselves. So please tell people about Tabletop Talespinners and where they can find some of your stuff or any projects that you have coming out soon.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you don't know who I am still, my name is Emma Kocar. I'm the founder and creative director of the Tabletop Talespinners Network, which is a TTRPG podcast network whose mission is diversity without tokenism and featuring players, but primarily GMs that you don't always see featured in other actual plays. I produce all of the podcasts currently on the network, of which we have 4 actively releasing. We have our fan favorite, which is our Monster Hearts 2 actual play podcast, All Our Faults, which is an incredible story GM'd by a trans woman, Mistress Winter, and we have 3 D&D 5e podcasts for all our 5e lovers out there, 2 of which I DM, which are Chronicles of Kriath, our long-term 5e campaign, for which both Robbie and Kali will be appearing in campaign 2, so keep an eye out for that. And Improv Madness, which is a one-shot podcast where both players and GMs, because we have a few guest GMs as well, come in with absolutely nothing prepared, and they create their characters and the one-shots on the spot. We also have Magnificence, which is GM'd by a good friend of mine, G, who they are creating a wonderful dark fantasy story, which I like to describe as Game of Thrones without all the shitty stuff. If you love like faction wars and like
political intrigue.
Exactly. That is the game for you. And I play a naive little Triton boy who steps in a ton of political shit when he didn't mean to, and it's great. We also stream live on Twitch and have quite a few campaigns going there. We have a not Monster Hearts, sorry. We have a Monsters and Other Childish Things series currently going that Mia from Cloaks and Capes is...
That's right, one of our artists and who also plays Corey in The Second Chances.
Boom.
Is currently playing in, so that should still be going. And we have the VODs from all of those up on our YouTube if you need to catch up before our next stream. That's every other Friday. We will also on Sundays be having a witchcraft stream starting here in November. So keep an eye out for that. That is an all-femme cast GM'd by our live stream producer Haven. And that is going to be insanely fun.
Yeah, make sure that you check the description. We will have links to the Tabletop Talespinners networks for you to be able to find any of these that sound like they might interest you.
Yeah. And then if you want to find anything that I've been on, my personal website should also be down there that has all of my GM and player credits on other things like the Vampire the Masquerade game I play with Robbie for Philly by Night.
That's right. Well, thank you again, Emma. It's been an absolute pleasure having you here. And if we can find a reason to have you back in the future, we will do that as well. You can, of course, find me on threads at Robbie_Landis01, Kali at Ascalia on Insta. And we are both on Twitch at Ascalia and Robbie_Landis. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in to the Cloaks and Capes podcast. So until next time, keep listening.
The Cloaks and Capes podcast is created by the support of its listeners and generous Patreon donors. Special thanks to our mythmakers and legends, Heartslot, Dolvik, Celtic Crow, Darkflux, Gamergal, Strix River, Tater Thoughts, and Capelli. Views and opinions expressed on this program are solely those of its hosts. Editing and production by Aaron Pillen and music provided by Aidan Hagland. If you want to support the Cloaks and Capes podcast, check out our Patreon over at patreon.com/Cloaks and Capes. And check us out on Threads and Instagram at Cloaks and Capes TTRPG.
I'm just going to tell you a thing that I've been feeling.
Okay. We're having intentional dialogue. I like this.
Yeah, as opposed to unintentional dialogue?